Welcome, friends. Welcome, Lou. How are you?
Doing very well. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. So, friends, I have a very interesting story for you today that has been fascinating me for a long time. Um, there are in this world today close to 8 billion people, and about 2.2 billion of those are Christian. And they follow different versions of Christianity, Catholicism, they're Protestants, and so on. This story you will find very, very interesting. I can promise you that if you don't know it already. Lou, you've heard it before, right?
Yes, a little bit of it, but we get to dig a little bit deeper here on this podcast, so I'm looking
We
forward
do.
to it. Yeah.
We do. So, just as a teaser, friends, just in case you decide that you want to go on to something else, let me tell you what this is about. It starts off the story with two shepherd boys in a part of Egypt in 1945 who were walking around the caves of the mountains there or the hills that their mother had told them to go and walk the goats. And mother had warned them, don't go inside these caves. There might be snakes in there might be animals, just stay out of the caves. But young boys, teenagers walking around outside the caves, bored, so they picked up some stones and they were throwing them inside the caves. Lo and behold, they heard the sound of some crackling pottery as they threw the stones. And they said, what is that? What could be breaking as we're throwing it? And as they threw more and more stones, they heard more and more pottery breaking. So they summoned up their courage. They went inside the caves and they found that there were many, many earthenware made of clay pots that were like 6 feet tall, all lined up inside these caves. Many, many, many of them. And those that were broken because of the rocks that they threw inside had spilled out papyrus rolls of parchment. Now, papyrus is a form of parchment. And on that, they opened these up and they found that there were things written in a language that they couldn't understand. The language was Aramaic, which was 400, no, it was actually almost 2,000 years old by the time, because this was 1945. These scrolls were written at the time of Jesus. This treasure that the boys found was worth more than the Pick Six Lotto that people are hitting today. It is worth much more, not just in terms of finances and money, because it would be worth that much, but also in terms of the importance of finding the original writings of the disciples of Jesus. So that's what this story is about today. And I just wanted to give you that as a story. What happened after that, I'll tell you. So
and I think we should preface this before it falls into people get a little nervous about a religious discussion. Jesus was an actual man. Jesus existed. What the story goes around for Christianity, Catholicism, we can have a debate about, what actually happened. But Jesus was an actual person, actually had disciples, actually had a large following in his time. That's undisputed.
Yeah. So I didn't know that it was in doubt, but yes, he was actually existing. He lived, and he had people that were his disciples. There were men who were disciples, and Mary Magdalene is well known as a female disciple. He had other female disciples also. So let's go back to, as Lou started off, talking about Jesus. Jesus was at the time a person that was revered. He gave sermons on the Mount and other places, and his disciples, who were Joseph, Matthew, Mark, John, and Judas, wrote down assiduously whatever he was talking about. These were written down in Aramaic, which was the language at the time, and were written down on parchment or papyrus. Those were saved after Jesus was crucified and then resurrected, but was no longer giving these sermons. These parchments and his teachings were spread by his disciples. That became the original teachings of Jesus Christ, but were not at that time termed a religion of Christianity. Many, many houses of worship started cropping up around the country at the time, and they were called churches, but they were not churches as we know churches today. Interestingly, 400 years after, approximately 400 years after Jesus was no more, a bishop called Athanasius made a decree, and he became very powerful. And I'm going to talk to you about that because that's the interesting part. He made a deal with the Roman emperors and the people in Rome to say, I will give you more power and more money than you can ever imagine, but let me be the head of this church. Instead, he was exiled 5 times from the church and deposed by the Constantine, and I will talk to you about this in detail, and thrown out because they said you're a manipulator of religion, get out of here, don't have nothing to do with the churches, etc. And I'll go into more detail of that. Until he outlived all of the Roman emperors. And then he made a deal with the Pope in the Vatican at the time, and he became the Archbishop, and he said, I will tell you what to do. One of the first things he did, is he said, I am the true bearer of Christianity. What I say goes. And he changed a lot of the things that Jesus had said. And this is all written up now. You'll find this quite interesting, friends. So just bear with me, because if you've not heard this before, you'll find that this is perhaps a little unbelievable. But I will tell you citations. You can look this up on the internet. You can look it up in these books and find out. So Athanasius said that his ancestors had seen Jesus after he was resurrected. And therefore, only Athanasius and his relatives and his friends could be clergy in the church that he was founding at the time. Lou, step in any time to correct me if I'm saying anything that is wrong or that you may have different opinions about or whatever.
No, actually, this story it's not new to me, but again, I'm just enjoying the details and finding a little bit more out about it.
I'm glad. So he said, and he had something that he wanted to push women out for whatever reason. He said, you can only get to God, and this is, to me, the one major. There are many differences between what Jesus actually said and his disciples wrote down on the parchment and what Athanasius said Christianity is going to do further. Athanasius said that any person wishing for salvation can only get it through the clergy of the church or through the church itself. Jesus never said that. Jesus said that to get to salvation, you have to look within yourself, be a good person, do good deeds, do good to your fellow human being, all of the things that we know about from the Bible. But Jesus never said, because at the time of Jesus, there were no churches.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as going to the Pope. There was no such thing as turning to the church to ask for permission to do this or that. There were no donations that you had to give to either Jesus or his followers or to the church. And where Athanasius said only his relatives and male relatives could be part of the clergy and not women, Jesus said that women had an absolute right to preach. And in fact, Mary Magdalene was his closest disciple. He was closest to her. In fact, some of the other disciples complained, and it's in one of the books, one of the Gospels, that they complained, how come Jesus kisses Mary on the mouth and none of us? Really? Have you heard that before?
No, that's new, but yeah.
Yeah, he says, how come Jesus kisses Mary on the mouth and none of us? And what makes him so much closer to her? So Jesus didn't hesitate to teach women, nor to have them as his disciples. In the gospel, and Athanasius also said that only he and his relatives, not he, because he was born 400 years after Jesus was no longer, but he said his relatives were the only people who saw Jesus after he was resurrected. However, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mary all state that Jesus was seen by many, including Mary, after resurrection. The teachings that were written down by the disciples on these parchment papers were known at the time as the Gnostic Gospels. Now, you can look up the meaning of Gnostic in Latin, but the Gnostic Gospel said that divinity, God, Lord, the power that gives us all life, contained both male and female aspects. Very important to note that God is not a male or a father. This is not the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. God contained, this is what Jesus said, that divinity had both male and female aspects, yet with neither male or female, such as consciousness. Consciousness, as is today's scientific view of God, scientific view of God today is that each one of us has within us consciousness, and that is us, our Atman, our soul. And that consciousness is part of a universal consciousness all around the universe. And that universal consciousness is God. That is neither male nor female, just as we are neither male or female in terms of our own inner consciousness. Just like electricity. Electricity gives light, but it's neither male nor female. It is just there. It's giving power. However, in 300 BCE, 300 years before Jesus, the Bible that was written at that time called God by the name of Yahweh. Yahweh, who you've all heard of, is still in the Bible and is considered a male, a father, a God. And the last thing I will say about this is that all self-realized souls, such as Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Moses, all have been known to go away for approximately 12 to 13 years to become self-realized by contemplating and sitting there within themselves and finding their own consciousness and making it one with the universal consciousness. That's what was considered to be self-realization. And Jesus too was known to have been away his missing 13 years, they're called. Okay, so far, Lou?
Yes.
Okay. So Jesus
But
prescribed.
one point, there was a
Sure.
Bible 300 years before Jesus?
Yeah, I didn't know that. It was I didn't know that it was called a Bible. I may have said Bible, but whatever the written portions of that were before Jesus, my understanding is that 300 years before that, it was called Yahweh. And I didn't know that. I thought that Judaism, which called Yahweh, came after Jesus, or that. But Jesus was a Jew, and he had some. So there have to have been Jews before Christianity came about through Jews. So I don't know those details, but
Yep.
I know that Yahweh was known and mentioned before Jesus. So Jesus prescribed, lead a good life, do good to others. Don't think just of yourself. Fight the temptations of the body, of the senses. Look inwards, find yourself. In Jesus's time, as I said before, there were no clergies, no Vatican, no confessions, etc.
Right.
So then what happened? What happened to these parchments? Why were they rolled up and put inside these earthen pots? Athanasius, the Archbishop of Alexandria, Egypt, wrote a letter in 367 after AD, 400 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. In that letter, which is a very famous letter, and I'll talk about it soon, in that letter, Bishop Athanasius gave the list of 27 books that would be included in the Christian New Testament. Now he came out with a New Testament. That letter that Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote said that only he, Archbishop Athanasius, had the authority to determine what was Christian. Now, he took that upon himself. Nobody, no God, Jesus, or his disciples gave him that authority. In fact, prior to this, many emperors had basically said, you need to leave the church and exiled him 5 times. Athanasius declared, this is the sad part, that Jesus, who all Christians and even non-Christians like myself respect so much, Athanasius said that all the texts and gospels written by the disciples of Jesus should be burned. And that's such a tragedy.
Yeah.
Joseph, John, Matthew, Mary, Judas, all of these various disciples, and maybe more, who had written down these disciples, he said, Athanasius said, were heresy and must be burned. Then he went on to say, if you have any of these parchments or papyrus or any notes, books, anything like that, because there weren't books as such at the time, and you don't give them up, then you will be burned at the stake. So, of course, he called them illegitimate and secret. He says these are secret doctrines that need to be burned. They're heresy. They're illegitimate. So, of course, people took these out of fear, went to Athanasius, threw them in the place that he lived, and his followers burned them. Anybody not burning them, even if they were accused of having them hidden somewhere, he would burn them at the stake. Horrible, horrible stories.
Classic human power grab right here.
Yeah. So there were some monks who absolutely refused privately and secretly to obey that word. So they said, absolutely not. These are very sacred documents. These were written by the disciples of Jesus 400 years ago. We are not burning them. At the risk of being burned at the stake, they went into these caves where these two shepherd boys were throwing stones 400 years later and hid those parchments inside these earthenware pots. On these rolls were written the sacred words of Jesus. And where were they? This was where today this area in Egypt is called Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi. The monks hid the rolls in 367 AD, 367 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And they were found in 1945, the last year of World War II. Now, when they were found, that was almost 1,580 years after they were hidden. For all that time, they stayed preserved. It was almost like the hand of God preserving them all this time.
Almost a miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they came out, and this is another part. This is a whole story in and of itself. If you read about it, you'll find it fascinating. What happened to these hundreds of documents? The kids picked them up, ran down the hills to their mother and said, Mom, look what we found. And the mother lived in a small little hut where she'd had sticks that she were burning to make a fire, just to boil the water and stuff like that. Very poor. And she said, oh, this must be very precious. She said, let's see if we can sell them. So she started going around the village where she lived and asked, and people looked at it and said, what is this? They couldn't even read the writing. They said, this has no value to us. So she spoke to her brother and said, take these to Cairo, Egypt, and see if you can find somebody to buy them. So her brother took a few of them, went to Cairo, showed them around the marketplace. Everybody looked at it, scoffed, and said, what is this? I can't even read it. I'm not interested. He said, give me anything, pennies for it. Nah, I don't want it. Take it away. So he brought it back to his sister, who said, well, then I might as well use it as firewood.
Yeah.
Can you believe this?
No, I saw that coming, but wow.
Let's burn this as firewood. So she started burning hundreds of these that were there as firewood. All these precious words from Jesus were burned. Fortunately for us, 80 of these documents were preserved. At the time that the World War was coming to an end, her brother again went to the marketplace and again in Cairo said, does anybody want this? One person, I think he was British, looked at it, recognized that this has some value. And he said, I don't know what this is. I'm not going to pay you a lot of money for it, but I'll pay you some. And he said, whatever you have, bring it to me and I'll pay you. So he paid him a small sum of money for it, took 80 of those parchments and took them back to England, to look to see what it was. When people who knew what these were and studied it, there was a big hue and cry. They said, this is Aramaic, and it is written by Joseph, Matthew, John, Judas, Mary, and these are the original disciples of Jesus. I mean, can you imagine if that came on the news today and they said we found documents with the original writings of the disciples of Jesus? I mean, gives me goosebumps.
I know, it's stunning.
So the Vatican stepped forward, and the Vatican said, we demand to verify the authenticity of these writings. So the Vatican took these 80 parchments under their care in 1945. And guess how long it took for the Vatican to decide that these were authentic?
20 years.
Yeah, 1945 until 1970.
Yep.
25 years. You were close.
Yeah, I was close, yeah.
1970, the Vatican said, yes, these are authentic documents written by the disciples of Jesus. But then they left it at that. They could have done so much more to say, yes, these are the original documents, and this is what Jesus, now we know this is what Jesus prescribed. This is what is different from what Jesus prescribed that we're doing. We're going to change it. But no, they didn't do that. But to our benefit, in 1978, a library was published, which was the complete translation of all these papyrus rolls. That library translated into English in 1978. For those of you who are interested, you can go to your local library and get it. It's called the Nag Hammadi Library, because that's where the papyrus was found, in the Nag Hammadi caves. 1978, the Nag Hammadi Library was published. And then 1979, 1 year later, Elaine Pagel, who was a professor of religion at Princeton University, wrote a book, a popular book that was both like a scientific treatise as well as a layperson's book, describing and talking about what these Gnostic Gospels were. That book that Elaine Pagels wrote was called the Gnostic Gospels. If you read it, it's a mind-blowing book. 5 years after that, Dan Brown, is that his name?
Yes.
Came out with this book called Da Vinci Code.
Mm-hmm.
And both Da Vinci Code and Gnostic Gospels essentially talked about the whole process of the teachings of Jesus being attempted to be changed or hidden. And now that I go back and read the book or the movie, Gnostic Gospels, Da Vinci Code, I find it fascinating. Later, the Chapman University came out, combined all the books and called them the Nag Hammadi Scriptures. And then lastly, in 2006, the National Geographic Society made an English translation of the Gospels of Judas. I didn't know that Judas had Gospels. Did you know that, Lou?
No, I didn't. No.
Yeah, Judas was known for other things, including a handful of coins, but not for his Gospels. But after all, he was a disciple of Jesus. I guess he had his own Gospels that he wrote. So that's the story up until that point. Now, the interesting part, and this is the part that I don't think I've told you before, Lou, is the story about Athanasius. Who was Athanasius? How did he come into this kind of power? And if all the emperors wanted him gone and banished him and exiled him, how come he ultimately ended up with so much power? Mm-hmm. Athanasius, from a very young age, was very, very interested in getting power for himself and riches. He was born in 296 AD, 300 years after Jesus was crucified. He was born, and he started at a very early age subscribing to the Creed of Nicaea. You may want to look up, friends, what the Creed of Nicaea is, but it was controversial at the time. And as he rose in his church, remember I told you that after Jesus was crucified, many houses of worship came up. They were all called churches, but they were not unified as under the Vatican as it is now. As Athanasius rose in power in his own local church, he asked everybody to subscribe to the same creed of Nicaea. And anybody that did not subscribe to the church, to the creed of Nicaea, he says, you may not enter this church. These complaints went up to Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire. And he was very upset. And in 328 AD, when Athanasius was just 32 years old, he was the person in charge of his local church, Athanasius. Emperor Constantine the Great warned him in writing. This is available to you to read on the internet. Emperor Constantine the Great wrote to Athanasius and warned him not to forbid entry to anyone just because they did not subscribe to the Creed of Nicaea. And Constantine said, if you do, you will be deposed from your position in the church and you will be exiled. Constantine's exact words are something to be looked at. I'll read them to you. Since you know my will, Constantine wrote, grant free admission to all those who wish to enter the church. For if I hear that you have hindered anyone from becoming a member, or you have debarred anyone from entrance, I shall immediately send someone, this is from Rome, I shall immediately send someone to have you deposed at my behest and have you sent into exile. Very powerful letter coming from the emperor of the great Roman Empire.
Very clear, yes.
Very clear. Most people would have been frightened away by that, but it didn't deter 32-year-old Athanasius. So what happened 5 years later? In 335 AD, Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire got tired of Athanasius disobeying him. He deposed Athanasius. This was the first exile, and exiled Athanasius to a place called Trier, Trier, Trier or Trier, which was at that time between Luxembourg and Germany. In 337 AD, to Athanasius's luck, Constantine died. When Athanasius heard that Constantine died, he returned to Alexandria, Egypt, Athanasius did, and went back to his church and said, okay, I'm the leader again. The new emperor, 2 years after that, heard about the complaints from the people of Alexandria, and the new emperor removed and deposed Athanasius and exiled him again. Athanasius contacted Pope Julius I and started to negotiate with him and said, look, if you give me more power, forget about the emperor. You and I can work together. If you give me more power, I'll make the Vatican very powerful and very rich. 7 years later, 346 AD, Athanasius was exiled 3 more times for various reasons by the emperor, always for forcing his own version of religion into his church. So this is written by the people who were exiling him. It says, always for forcing your own version of religion into your church, you've been exiled. After 5 exiles, Athanasius outlived all the emperors who were protective of their churches and religion. And in 366 AD, when Athanasius was 70 years old, 40 years after he was first exiled, Athanasius declared himself as the archbishop because all the emperors were gone, and he had connections with the Pope, and he had a deal, and he promised Rome power over the people and unlimited wealth, quote unquote. In 373 AD, at the age of 77, Athanasius died. But what happened between those years when he became the archbishop, he declared himself at 366 AD. 1 year later, 367 AD, this is something that you must read. It's known as the famous letter, which is the 39th Festal, Festal letter of 367 AD, in which he says, I am the person that declares what is to be Christianity, what isn't, which are the 27 books that you may read. The Vatican in Rome approved of Athanasius' letter and his decree and said everything was fine. Alexandria, Egypt, did not approve of his manipulations of religion just to get power and control.
Yeah.
So, but that has continued from then until now. And had it not been for these two shepherd boys, we may never have known of these differences. Had they not find those scrolls might still be there in the caves somewhere. So that's the story of the Gnostic Gospels. Have I left out anything, Lou?
No, I'm just fascinated. Having been raised Catholic, it's always been my feeling that there is this struggle between quote unquote God and the church trying to find its own power and trying to find its, the church is human based and it's made of man. So it's power hungry. And that's always been my impression of the Catholic Church. I can't speak for other Christianities or other religions, but seems like the beginning of it, the very start of it.
Yeah. Well, for those who respect Christianity as I do and the teachings of Jesus, at least we know that there is a whole other literature that one must look at. If I were Christian and I spent a lot of time in the church and I spent a lot of time with Christian teachings, but I had not heard of the Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah, so the church never embraced them, other than acknowledging they were real. They never really embraced them as part of their teaching or part of their religious structure.
One time I went to Barnes and Nobles and I asked the person who was at the counter, who was about 70 years old, and I said, where would you have books about the Gnostic Gospels? And this 70-plus-year-old man looked at me and said, you want to know about the Gnostic Gospels? Why? And I said, why not? And he says, well, actually, it is the most asked for book, as far as I know, here in Barnes and Nobles. Wow. He says, more people come here and ask about that than any other book. And when you start to read, friends, about the Gnostic Gospels, start with the Elaine Pagel's book, and you'll find that it's fascinating because what it teaches us about how to live as human beings, how to be as good Christians, how to be as good human beings is mind-blowing. It's very, very nice. And what Jesus taught, puts an added layer onto Christianity as it is followed today.
My guess is it's based in individual power as opposed to the quote unquote power of the church, which is the basis of the Catholic Church anyway.
Yes, it says that Jesus said that to achieve, to become self-realized, to become one with God, to get to that point of revelation, you need to look within yourself, to be a good person. That you cannot get there if you just follow the dictates of your wishes, your desires, your body, your 5 sense organs that keep asking for things. If you have to fight them to become a good person and look within yourself.
Sounds a lot like what we dealt with on the podcast about the Gita.
Yes. I think the original religions going back many 2,000 years ago and more, all talked about the same way of reaching God.
And God not being the Catholic Church version of God, which is a man with a white beard sitting on a throne somewhere in heaven, but being basically ourselves, our consciousness, our collective consciousness. Collective
consciousness, universal consciousness, neither male nor female, no white hair, no black hair, no nothing. Just consciousness, like electricity.
Yep, fascinating. Another great story. Yeah.
Thank you, Lou. So if you need to ask me any questions or contact us, you can reach me by arisearjuna@gmail.com. Be happy to answer your questions or comments. Thank you. See you next time.